A couple months ago, we posted a video about winter harvesting our root vegetables, like potatoes, carrots, and even onions, despite the fact that it was the end of January and it was minus 15 degrees Celsius. Since then, the weather has fluctuated quite a bit, with the temperatures ranging from the mid-20s below zero to even a few days in the upper teens above zero. Even now that it's finally spring, just a few days ago it was minus 10 degrees Celsius and we had about 5 centimeters of snow. And now today it's +6 and all of the snow has all but melted. So needless to say, Mother Nature has really been keeping us on our toes. But despite that, here I am once again at the end of March, heading to the garden to harvest some carrots that we planted nearly a year ago. If you missed that last video, I highly recommend you check it out as well, because in it I went into a lot more detail about how these veggies were grown and how they were protected from the snow and the cold. But the main detail is that, like everything else in our garden, they were all planted within a thick layer of mulch. In the case of these carrots, the seeds were sown in a bed that was covered in rotting wood chips, and then, once winter hit, I covered them with an additional layer of fallen leaves. So now today, at the end of March, as I pull the leaves back to find the plants, you can see that there are still plenty of ice crystals in patches of the soil underneath. But despite that, none of this soil is frozen solid. I can still easily break it apart with my hands. Once I finally find a row of carrots, like before, their remaining tops are still clearly visible and surprisingly green. Don't forget, these have been covered in mulch and snow for about 4 months at this point. Back in January, I needed a hay fork to loosen the carrots before pulling them from the ground. But as you can see, that's no longer necessary. All of these are coming out easily by hand. And for the most part, the actual carrots themselves look completely normal, as though I was harvesting them last fall. In fact, the only issues I can see with any of these carrots are the result of initial growing conditions, like some inadequate spacing, or the odd hungry critter. For example, though it may be a bit hard to see it on the camera, I found a little tunnel here through the soil and mulch, and it leads right to a couple of half-eaten carrot roots. I also found a couple of carrots that seem to have been completely hollowed out from the inside, leaving only a paper-thin shell of carrot skin. But I have no idea what kind of animal would have done this, so please leave a comment if you know the likely culprit for these. Was it an insect or a rodent? Either way, I'm actually kind of impressed with their handiwork. And luckily only a couple of them seem to have been affected. All the rest of the carrots look great. So we'll check these out in more detail once I get them into the kitchen, but so far I have no reason to believe these will be anything but crunchy, juicy, and delicious. Which in itself is pretty wonderful, because prior to this experiment, I would have assumed that best case they'd be woody, tasteless, and virtually inedible at this point. But just as an aside, I'm not actually sure why I previously would have assumed that. Because like the kale plants we've talked about in another video, carrots are biennials, meaning that they typically live for 2 or more seasons and only produce flowers and seeds after overwintering. So their roots can obviously tolerate the cold. Plus, one of the ways the plants prepare for the cold is by converting their complex carbohydrates into simple sugars. This acts like a form of antifreeze, but as a side benefit, it also makes them taste much sweeter. So if they're still fine to eat at the end of the first season, when the plant essentially goes dormant for winter, and since we know they survive the winter and that the cold makes them sweeter, why would I think that they'd suddenly change entirely by the beginning of spring? Honestly, I'm not even sure anymore. And that's why in the previous video I said that these types of lessons make me feel like my whole world just got a little bigger. Because thanks to both winter sowing and now winter harvesting, I'll never again see our Canadian gardening season being confined to only a few short months. And likewise, this new knowledge also feels like toothpaste that can no longer be put back into the tube. Which begs the question, what else don't I know that someday will seem so obvious? What other wonderful little world-expanding lesson am I going to learn this year? You know, gardening is fun. And speaking of which, here's something else I just noticed. Back in January, I discovered that the mulch-covered soil in the garden could easily be pierced by a hay fork, while the sod-covered soil right outside the garden was like a solid block of ice. But check this out. Today, at the end of March, the ground is still rock solid over here, where it's still covered in a bit of that recent snow, and as you might expect, it gradually becomes softer as I get out into the open, where it's less protected from the sun. And likewise, inside the garden, the fork easily pushes into this bed, covered in rotten wood chips, and this bed, covered in old fallen leaves, but then it barely pierces at all into this path covered in sawdust. Now, by definition, the path gets more foot traffic than the no-till beds, and so compaction likely has something to do with it. But the sod outside the fence gets plenty of foot traffic too, not to mention the occasional car, truck, and even tractor. So more likely, I think it might be due to the fact that the sawdust really soaks up water, and is therefore more likely to freeze solid. In fact, in the summer, I often refer to these sawdust paths as our water batteries, because they easily hold onto the rain for several days, even in the hot sun, and then presumably transfer it to the plants over time through capillary action. But in the early spring, it seems like the sawdust may also hold onto the ice a lot longer as well, which could easily prevent our soil from warming up as quickly as it otherwise might. But then again, right under the frozen sawdust, I immediately find earthworms wriggling around, so clearly it can't be that cold down there. Plus, with them in mind, perhaps I should be a little less careless with all my stabbing. Oh, and while we're down here, ice isn't the only thing holding all of this sawdust together. Because if we look really closely, you can also see what I assume is a whole bunch of fungal mycelium. Now, that deserves an entire video all on its own, but essentially these are kind of like fungus roots, and they play a huge role in decomposition and other natural processes. So when we talk about our mulch providing nutrients to our soil as it breaks down over time, in no small part, it's thanks to this stuff. But unfortunately, it's not all good news under the sawdust, because here's a thin strip of plastic. And while it's pretty common to see bits of plastic blowing around in the environment these days, this one in particular likely came from the cardboard that we laid down under the sawdust when we were first sheet mulching. You see, before it ends up in our garden, our cardboard generally starts out as flattened boxes. And despite our best efforts at peeling off all the packing tape, clearly some of it gets left behind. And unfortunately, it'll take a lot more than earthworms and fungus to break this down. But on the other hand, sometimes that's a good thing, like in this case, where we're continuing our previous weed killing experiment using a strip of silage tarp. And if you missed that video, as usual, I'll place a link in the description, but spoiler alert, it works really well. And before we head out to the potatoes, I might as well show you another little mini experiment we're trying this year. You see, as our regular viewers will know, we tend to grow a lot of garlic and have posted a pile of videos about that topic in the past. But because we live in Canada, we've only ever grown hardneck garlic, mostly due to the fact that it's considered more cold hardy. However, this year we're also growing softneck to see how it does with our usual Ruth Stout inspired deep mulch method. So at the end of last season, we planted half of this bed with softneck and the other half with hardneck, and I can already see a tiny difference. As usual, our hardneck garlic plants are already poking up through the mulch. The shoots are small but mighty, and they look nice and green and healthy. Whereas on the other side, I don't see any softneck shoots at all. However, when I lift up some of the mulch, fallen leaves in this case, I can see that the shoots are there but not yet poking through. And as a result, they're still looking pretty yellow. So are the softneck shoots just weaker and less capable of poking through the mulch? Are they stunted because of the cold, or are they simply a bit slower to get going? I guess time will tell. But for now, let's check on the spuds. So by the end of January, I had already written off our onions and noticed that some of the potatoes were starting to show signs of damage due to the cold. So while I've had continued confidence in the carrots, I now approach this bed with lukewarm uncertainty. Once again, I'll place some links in the description for other videos where we've explained how we grow our potatoes and why we surround them with a perimeter of onions. But most importantly, as should be obvious by now, we grow them under mulch. In this case, old spoiled hay throughout the season, and then an insulating layer of fallen leaves once it got really cold outside. As I initially pull the mulch back, the first problem is just finding a row that hasn't already been picked. Then when I did find some, I noticed that most of the smaller potatoes are completely inedible. Some seem okay at first, but end up having soft spots, and others are just little balls of watery mush. Bottom line, none of these will make it back to the kitchen. But then, after a bit more digging around, I eventually found another row where the potatoes are still perfectly intact. All of these feel nice and firm and show no obvious signs of cold damage or rodent activity. I even found a couple of onions that seem pretty solid as well, but like last time, you never really know until you clean them up and cut them in half. So on that note, let's head inside. Now, I won't go into much detail here because, again, I've already covered this quite a bit previously. But after letting the veggies warm up a bit, I scrubbed off the dirt and then inspected them. Once again, the carrots look, feel, and taste perfect, just like eating them fresh after a fall harvest, except even sweeter due to the cold. The potatoes are also pretty similar to last time, with some better than others. For example, about half are completely normal. No weird texture or discoloration. When I cut into them and gave them a taste, they're crunchy and flavorful. Again, just like any other freshly harvested potato. But then others show signs of cold damage, like this one with the darker ring on one side. Otherwise, though, I'd say that these are still okay to eat as long as you cut off the damaged part. However, there are also a number of potatoes that have large, soft spots where the cold has obviously reduced them to mush. And the damage is even more obvious when I cut them in half, as you can see in this cross section. I can't say if the undamaged parts would still be safe to eat, but I don't think I'd personally take the chance. Even if they are still edible, that doesn't mean they're appetizing. And finally, these onions actually look and feel even better than the ones I harvested in the last video. The only visible signs that these aren't onions from our pantry is this slight darkening on some of the inner layers. But unlike the last ones, they don't feel soft or spongy at all. If anything, I'd say that these remind me of onions that had just been in storage for a while. So, past their prime perhaps, but still more than acceptable. So, at this point, I'd just like to say a huge thanks for all of your comments, tips, and suggestions. Not having to harvest all of our veggies in the fall and then find a place to store them all winter is completely game-changing for us, and we'd never have even thought to try it if it wasn't for your comments. So by all means, please keep them coming, because it's finally spring, and I can't wait to see what comes next. But in the meantime, thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon. Remember when I said that Mother Nature's been keeping us on our toes? Well, as I upload this now at the beginning of April, it's snowing again. Anyway, see you guys soon. So what's the big idea here, Fender? Well, at least I know where the other carrot went now. Oh, you made such a mess. You could have at least let me clean it first, buddy.